It's one thing to start learning how to code and learning how to use a programming language, but it's another thing to start using developer tools. When I was learning how to code in university, we didn't focus too much on dev tools. We were just focusing on the language itself and different programming concepts. But when I got to my job, there were all these dev tools that I had to learn, I had to pick up on the job. When I learned them, it helped me become a proficient software developer. It's like being a chef. When you are a chef, you know how to cook, you know how to put certain ingredients together, you know the measurements you need to follow this certain recipe. But then you also have tools, and if you have better tools, maybe you have a way to cut your vegetables better or to cook your meat better. Those tools are really key to helping you become more efficient at cooking. When I see people talking online about the development tools that they use, I can't really relate sometimes. Sometimes I feel that the tools that they mention are really niche. It's for their software development field, but mine is different than theirs, so I can't really relate. So when I thought about this video, what are the top 3 developer tools that every programmer should know, I'm gonna bring up things that every developer, everyone in every niche should know. And the ones that I'm going to be talking about are ones that I actually use at my current job and ones that I've used in my previous job. And my previous job was a different field than what I'm in currently. In this video, I'll be talking about the 3 developer tools that every programmer should know, and then why each one is important and how I've used each one in the software industry. So let's discuss. Stay tuned to the end because after I share my top 3 dev tools, I'm going to talk about a bonus tool. So the first tool I think you should learn is Terminal. And Terminal is just a command line interface where you type in text as input, and then it gives you, when you press enter, it gives you a text-based output. Of course, that's not a real command. A real command would be something like ls, and then you can see all the directories in your file directory, in your home directory. And the reason why Terminal is so important is because it's like opening up the car hood to do some diagnostics. If you want to figure out what's wrong with your computer, Terminal is one of the best places to go. Of course, you can use GUI or user interfaces to figure out what's wrong, but when those fail, the only thing that you have left is the terminal, and that's why the terminal is so important. It's like your car broke down and then you want to figure out what's wrong with your car. Of course, you can look at the dashboard, you can look at outside, you can look at it from the outside, but if you really want to figure out what's going on, you will eventually have to open up the hood. Now, Terminal is not only for diagnostics, but you can do a lot of things with Terminal, and if you really want to use your computer to its fullest potential, you're definitely going to have to use Terminal at some point. Now, some of you may be thinking, I don't really have Terminal on my computer. Well, if you have a Mac or if you have Linux, you definitely have Terminal. I have a Mac and this is Terminal on Mac. So if you're using a Windows machine, you're probably not going to use Terminal. You'll probably use something like CMD or PowerShell or maybe Git Bash, but you should definitely learn those for Windows. When I would use Terminal for Linux, we would often use Terminal to install programs. For example, in Ubuntu, you would often do sudo apt-get install and then whatever program you would have. Another way that I've used Terminal for my computer is to configure some sort of computer setting. For example, the network settings. I would often do ipadder, or I would do ifconfig to configure the network from my computer. Many times I've used Terminal as a sort of text editor. For example, I use VI a lot to do some sort of editing on a file. Lastly, one of the major things I've done in Terminal is to run some sort of script. A lot of times we would have a script. Okay, so I just created a script that would say hello. If you look at the script, and then it just says hello. So I can run the script here, and this is really helpful for automation. And you don't have to use a bash script, you can use Python scripts. Lastly, I would often use Terminal for Git commands. That's the second tool that I think every developer should know, and every developer would probably agree with me. Git is really useful when it comes to writing code. So what is Git? Git is just a version control system that keeps track of your different versions of your code. For example, if you have a really good version of your code, you can commit that version to your version control, and then you can make some changes, and if you like those changes, then you commit that version to version control. For example, when I first started learning how to code, I would have a main.c file, and then when I liked it, I would create a main1.c file that I can revert to later in case I mess something up in my main.c file. Git just makes it all easier so that you don't have to keep track of all these numbers in your head. You can just commit your changes when you like them, and then you'll have different versions of your code. And this just shows an example of a timeline of your versions of code. Another reason why Git is really important is because it helps you collaborate with other programmers. In this picture, it's showing how there's one main version here, then they have another version, and then they have another version here. These two versions come from this version, and these two lines here are called branches. The orange line is one branch of code, and then the blue one is called another branch of code, like a tree. You have one common version that they both came from, but this version has some other developer's code on it, and then this, for example, would have your code changes on it, and then you both would have two different versions of the code, but it allows you to both develop simultaneously. And then when your coworker's done developing his code, he'll bring his changes back into your branch so that you guys can have the same code again. It kind of like sync up your versions of code. So now this happens a lot in my company, or in both my companies. We would have different developers coding and then bringing it back to the main branch. And in some cases, the latest version of the code would have a lot of bugs in it, and it would be a critical bug that really messed up the program. So we'd have to figure out who caused it or how did that happen. So a lot of times what I've done is I would look at this version of the code and see if the bug is there. If the bug is not there, then we can deduce that this guy, when he brought his code in, he introduced a bug into our code. And we've saved a lot of time doing this sort of process of going back to older versions and seeing if the code is broken at that point or not. So how does that relate to GitHub? GitHub is just a platform that you can use, that anybody can use. You don't have to pay anything, it's all free. And they allow you to do this sort of thing individually or in a group. So I have a folder called GitHub in my computer, and it just has all of my repositories. Repositories is the name that they call it for a programming project. So I have different programming projects that I've done for this channel. So these projects are all public. I can put a link in the description if you want to look at it. But GitHub would just host your code, and you can see your code in here. For example, here I have a calculator program. So you can see your code there. If you're going to start learning how to code, you should definitely create a GitHub repository so you can put all of your projects in your repository. And speaking of GitHub projects, if you're just learning how to code, I have a free guide for you called my 30-day beginner coding challenge. And in this challenge, it's just 30 days, and it's a free challenge that you can download for free in the link in the description. And in that challenge, I give you 4 programming projects that you can build, and I guide you through each programming project, how to build it, what things you need to learn to build each project. And it's a really helpful guide, and you can definitely use it with GitHub. You can open up a GitHub account, and then you can bring those projects into your GitHub. The tutorials that I give in this challenge are written in C, but of course you can take the programming concepts that you learn from these tutorials and apply them in any programming language that you like. Just click the link in the description down below to download it, and if you download it and pay attention to what it says, you'll definitely learn some fundamental programming concepts that will give you a good foundation to start off your software development career. Okay, the third dev tool that every programmer should know is an IDE, or an integrated development environment. And in this video, I'm showing you Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code is a common IDE that people use. Other common ones are Visual Studio and then Eclipse. And if you're into Android development, I used Android Studio. But when you start coding in your job, you might be using IDEs that your company wants you to use. But these are the general ones. These are the ones that I found in my previous job and that I found in my current job. It's going to be Visual Studio Code, Visual Studio, and Eclipse. Those are the common ones that I've seen used everywhere. It doesn't really matter which IDE you use first because they're all very, very similar. For example, they all have this file explorer that you can use to navigate your project. I opened a project called Calculator. That's the project I was showing you earlier, the Calculator project. So I have calculator.c, and so it's in my file system, but your IDE is going to access your file system and open your code here. And what's nice about an IDE is they give you a nice code editor, and this is the code editor. It makes it really pretty, like the different parts of your program. It gives it a nice color. For example, when I was coding in university, this is what we had. they didn't tell us to use an IDE. They told us to use VI or Emacs, and it doesn't look as pretty. But if you look at it in an IDE, it looks a lot prettier and easier to follow. Another thing that's cool about IDEs is, for example, say you missed to put a semicolon there, it will alert you. There's going to be a red squiggly, and it will tell you that there's some error with your code, and it'll have a color here that's, oh, it's red. What's going on? Oh, something's missing. So you just put the semicolon there, save it, and then your IDE is happy again. Another thing that's good about IDEs is that it helps you run your code, so you can run your code here. You can do 7 plus 7, 14. No. You can do it in your terminal as well, but you have to compile it here. This is what we learned in our university. You have to compile it, and then you run the file that the executable that your compiler built. So you can run it here, 7 plus 7, 14. No, it's just less convenient because you have to type GCC every time, then you have to run the executable. But in the IDE, you can just run it here. Oh, and here, by the way, it already has a terminal built in, so that's really nice too. You can just have the terminal in here. The last major benefit of IDEs is using the debugger. In a debugger, you can put in some what they call breakpoints in your code. So your code will run all these lines of code, and then it'll stop here. And then you can use a debugger to see what the values are of certain variables. So you can add this to something called a watch window, and then you can see what is this value after the user inputs a certain value. And then your code will stop here, and then it'll show you what the value is of that. Without the debugger, you would have to do something like printf here just to see what the value is at that point. But with a debugger, you don't have to write any code. You can just stop your code in the middle of its execution and then see what the value is. You can sometimes hover over it and it'll tell you, or you can look at it in the watch window. All right, so those are my top 3 dev tools that every programmer should know. It's going to be Terminal, Git, and IDEs. Now, what is my bonus dev tool? Atlassian. And the reason why I mentioned Atlassian as a bonus tool is because it's not really a dev tool, it's more of a project management tool. But it's a tool that I've used constantly, and I've used with a lot of different programming teams, a lot of different software development teams. It has Jira that I've often used in my teams for assigning different tasks to people and making sure that we're making some progress in our development. Another one that we've used is Confluence. Confluence is just a way to organize our work together and create documents like what it says here. You can put some sort of to-do list or some sort of documentation for your code in Confluence. That's how I've used it, or maybe some build procedures for your code. I've done that with Confluence. The last reason why I mentioned Atlassian as a bonus tool is because I don't think if you're just learning how to code, you should use Atlassian. You're really going to use Atlassian when you start working in your internship or at your job, and that's why I mentioned it as a bonus tool. All right, I'd love to hear from you. Which tools are you using right now? Do you use Terminal, or do you use Git, or do you use an IDE? I'd love to know which IDEs you guys are using, or if you're using Terminal, I'd love to hear how you're using it. And if I mentioned a tool that you're not using yet, you should definitely start learning it, and leave a comment which tool you're going to start learning today. All right, like I mentioned earlier, if you're just starting off in your programming journey and you don't know where to start, you can download my 30-day beginner coding challenge. And it's a 30-day guide where I teach you how to build those 4 beginner programming projects. It's really beginner friendly, and I go step by step on how to build each one and go through the tutorials that you need to build each one. So download that in the link in the description. All right, that's it for this week's video. Thanks for watching. I hope it really helped you out. If you have any other questions, feel free to let me know in the comments section, and I hope to see you in the next one. Peace.